I clocked in just before 8 p.m., my backpack slung over one shoulder and my phone clutched in the other hand. The little bell above the door jingled as I stepped into Havisham Toy Box, a vintage toy store that felt like it hadn't changed since the 1940s. Rows of shelves crammed with porcelain dolls, wooden trains, and marionettes line the narrow aisles. Their glassy eyes and painted smiles always gave me the creeps. But hey, college isn't cheap, and a paycheck is a paycheck. Mrs. Havisham, the store's owner, was at the counter as usual. She stood tall and thin, her silver hair swept into a bun so tight it looked like it hurt. Her eyes were sharp behind cat-eye glasses, and she wore the kind of old-fashioned floral dress that matched the faded wallpaper.
Becky, you are here right on time, as always.
I managed a polite smile. Yep, here to close up. She pushed a folded piece of paper toward me.
The rules as always. Read them, follow them, no exceptions.
I took the paper, though I already knew what it would say. This was my third week here, and she gave me the same speech every shift. I unfolded it anyway. Rules for the dolls. 1. Never move a doll if its eyes are open. 2. Avoid direct eye contact with any doll after midnight. 3. If a doll seems to have changed position, say, "I see you," and walk away. 4. Do not let any doll sit on the counter. 5. At 3:33 a.m., close your eyes and keep them shut for exactly 30 minutes. I sighed and looked up at her. Don't you think this is a little overkill? They're just dolls. Mrs. Havisham's lips thinned.
The dolls are antiques. Old things carry old energy. You do well to respect them.
Right, I said, stuffing the paper into my pocket. I didn't have the energy to argue, and she was paying me to keep my mouth shut and follow the rules, not to play detective.
Good girl. Lock up when you're done, and don't dawdle.
The bell jingled again as she left, her heels clicking on the pavement outside. I locked the door behind her and exhaled, glancing around the store. The dolls stared back at me from their perches, their painted faces frozen in serene or mischievous expressions. It wasn't just the dolls. The whole store had a weird vibe. The air felt heavier than it should, and the faint smell of lavender and dust clung to everything. I shook it off. A long shift was ahead of me, and I wasn't about to let some creepy old toys mess with my head. I flipped through the checklist Mrs. Havisham had left for me. Dust the shelves, clean the counter, make sure the register's balanced. Nothing unusual. Just another quiet night, or so I thought. As I got to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was silly, of course. The store was empty except for the toys. But every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a tiny shadow where there shouldn't be one. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe the flickering fluorescent lights above. Still, I avoided looking at the dolls too long. Just in case. By the time I finished the cleaning and the registers, it was past 11. I glanced at the clock above the counter and groaned. Only 6 more hours to go. I grabbed a broom and started sweeping the floor. As I passed one of the shelves, something caught my eye. One of the dolls, a porcelain one in a frilly pink dress, was lying on its side. I could have sworn it had been sitting up earlier. I stopped sweeping and stared at it. Hadn't I just walked by this shelf? The doll's eyes were open. I swallowed hard and stepped back. The rules. What was the rule about this? Don't move it if its eyes are open. Right. I left it where it was, finishing the sweeping in double time. I told myself it was nothing. I'd knocked it over while dusting earlier, probably. But the feeling of unease was harder to shake now. As midnight crept closer, I caught myself glancing at the list of rules again, reading them over and over. The words didn't feel as ridiculous as they had earlier. By the time the clock struck 12, I wasn't sure if I was imagining things anymore. And the night had just begun. The chime of the clock striking midnight was loud enough to make me flinch. I glanced at it, a dusty, old thing mounted high on the wall behind the counter. 12 gongs, slow and deliberate, echoed through the store, each one tightening the knot in my stomach. I leaned the broom against the counter and rubbed my arms. It was getting colder in here. The air conditioning wasn't on, but the chill crept in like a draft slipping through unseen cracks. I glanced toward the doll aisle. A dozen pairs of glassy eyes stared back, unmoving but unnerving all the same. "You're fine," I muttered to myself, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. "Just tired. Finish up and get out of here." I decided to check the aisles again, not because I wanted to, but because sitting still made my skin crawl. With my phone flashlight in hand, I moved down the first aisle, scanning the shelves for anything out of place. That's when I heard it. A soft, high-pitched giggle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight beam wavered as I whipped it around the store, searching for the source of the sound. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed faintly, but there was no reply. The sound hadn't been close, more like it had come from the back of the store, where the dolls were. My heart thudded in my chest, and I tried to laugh it off. It had to be the wind rattling something or a floorboard creaking. Or maybe one of those creepy motion-activated toys Mrs. Havisham had stashed somewhere. I didn't move right away. My legs felt rooted to the spot, but my flashlight beam wavered toward the doll aisle anyway. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to move. Step by step, I inched toward the aisle, bracing for I didn't know what. As I turned the corner, my flashlight landed on the shelves, illuminating the rows of dolls sitting prim and proper. Nothing looked out of place. "See?" I muttered. "Nothing. Just my." Then I saw her. The doll in the pink dress, the one I'd left lying on its side, was sitting up again. I froze, my flashlight locked on her tiny, perfectly painted face. Her eyes, wide, bright, and unblinking, seemed to meet mine. "Nope," I whispered, stepping back quickly. "The rules. What was the rule for this?" My brain scrambled to remember. "Oh, I see you." Clearing my throat, I said the words out loud, though my voice came out shaky. "I see you." Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. I was talking to a doll. A freaking doll. Shaking my head, I turned to leave the aisle, pretending that I didn't feel like someone or something was watching me. That's when I noticed the floor. The dust I'd just swept an hour ago now had small tracks running through it. Tiny, precise footsteps, like those of a child, or something pretending to be one. I stepped back again, nearly tripping over my own feet. The cold feeling in the store was worse now, pressing down on my chest like a weight. I hurried back to the counter, setting the flashlight down and gripping the edges of the wood as if it could somehow ground me. "Stop it," I hissed under my breath. "You're fine. There's nothing here. Nothing." Another sound, this one closer, made me jump. A faint tapping, like little fingers drumming on wood. Slowly I looked down at the counter. A doll was sitting there now. A different one, dressed in a blue sailor suit with curly blonde hair. It hadn't been there before. "Okay," I whispered, my pulse pounding in my ears. "The rules. Do not let any doll sit on the counter." I reached for the doll, hesitating when its painted eyes seemed to follow my hand. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, half expecting it to wriggle in my grasp. It didn't, but it felt heavier than I thought it would. Carefully, I placed it back on the nearest shelf and stepped away, muttering, "I see you," again for good measure. I turned back toward the counter, but my stomach dropped. Another doll was sitting there now, its head tilted slightly to the side, its smile just a little too wide. I didn't move this one. Instead, I whispered, "I see you," and backed away slowly, trying to ignore the rising panic clawing at my chest. The air in the store felt thicker, heavier, the shadows deeper. The rules didn't seem silly anymore. They felt like the only thing keeping me alive. I stood there, staring at the counter like it had turned into something alive. The second doll, the one with the wide grin and the tilted head, didn't move. It just sat there looking at me, but that made it worse somehow. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I nearly screamed. Heart pounding, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was just a notification, but the sight of the battery icon made my stomach drop. 19% left. "Great," I muttered. "Just great." I turned back to the doll, but it wasn't there anymore. My breath hitched. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't seen it fall. It was just gone. I took a shaky step back, my phone's flashlight still in hand, its beam trembling as much as my grip. I didn't care how ridiculous it sounded anymore. I grabbed the list of rules out of my pocket and read it again, scanning for anything I might have missed. Rule 3. If a doll seems to have changed position, say, "I see you," and walk away. I'd already done that. Twice. Lifia. Do not let any doll sit on the counter. I'd moved one, and the other. What had happened to the other? A loud pop echoed through the store, and then everything went black. My flashlight blinked out, plunging me into darkness so complete it felt suffocating. For a second I couldn't breathe. No, 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 I whispered, fumbling with my phone. I tapped the screen, but it stayed dark. The battery was fine, I'd just seen it. But the flashlight wouldn't work. I tapped it again and again, the sound of my shaking breaths filling the silence. And then the silence ended. Soft scuttling noises came from the doll aisle, like tiny feet padding across the floor, like fabric brushing against wood. I backed toward the counter, gripping my useless phone like it could save me. This isn't real, I whispered to myself, over and over. It's not real. It's not real. The scuttling grew louder. Closer. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like jelly. My back hit the counter and I froze. My eyes adjusted just enough to make out vague shapes, rows of shelves, outlines of toys, shadows that didn't feel quite right. Something giggled again, this time closer. Who's there? My voice cracked and I hated how scared I sounded. The scuttling stopped. The store went silent again, but the silence felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. I swallowed hard and did the only thing I could think of. I see you, I said, my voice shaking. Nothing. I see you, I repeated, louder this time. Still nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching my phone and staring into the darkness. Minutes? Hours? The silence stretched on, pressing against my ears like a weight, and I started to think maybe it had stopped, maybe whatever I'd heard or imagined was gone. Then something brushed against my ankle. I screamed and scrambled onto the counter, my knees knocking against the wood. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor with a sound that echoed through the store. I was shaking all over, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I peered over the edge of the counter, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. In the faint moonlight filtering through the windows, I saw it. The doll in the pink dress was at the base of the counter, her tiny porcelain hand reaching up like she was trying to climb. Her head tilted back and her eyes met mine. I choked on a sob and scrambled back, pressing my hands to my mouth to keep from screaming again. The scuttling started up once more. Not just one set of feet now, but dozens. They were coming. I sat huddled on the counter, my knees pulled up to my chest and my hands gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles ached. My breaths came short and shallow, and every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. The scuttling noises were everywhere now, echoing from every aisle, creeping closer. My mind raced, trying to piece together the rules. Don't make eye contact after midnight. Don't move them if their eyes are open. What good were the rules when I couldn't even see? Something clattered on the floor, a wooden thud, like one of the marionettes dropping from its hook. I flinched and pressed my back harder against the shelves behind me, trying to keep my breathing quiet. The clock chimed again. One deep, echoing gong. Midnight was over. It was 1 a.m. now, and I was trapped. A soft giggle cut through the darkness, this time closer than before. Stop, I whispered, more to myself than anything else. Just stop. The giggling didn't stop. Desperate, I reached for my phone, which had fallen off the counter earlier. My fingers fumbled in the dark, brushing against smooth porcelain instead of cold metal. I yanked my hand back like I'd been burned. Nope. 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 Nope, I muttered, shaking my head. My voice sounded small and pathetic, like a kid hiding under the covers from the monster in the closet. Something heavy shifted behind me, and I spun around instinctively. Big mistake. One of the dolls was perched on the shelf just inches from my face. Her wide, unblinking eyes stared straight at me, her tiny lips curled into a smile that didn't belong on something that shouldn't be alive. I gasped and scrambled away, nearly falling off the counter in the process. I see you, I blurted out, the words tumbling out of me before I could think. The doll didn't move. I repeated the phrase louder, forcing myself to stare at her until my eyes burned. I see you. The doll's head tilted to one side, as if she were considering me, before the smile faded from her face. She toppled backward off the shelf and disappeared into the shadows below. I didn't wait to see where she went. I grabbed the edge of the counter, hoisting myself back into a sitting position. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I glanced toward the aisles, hoping, praying, that maybe they'd stopped moving. Maybe saying the phrase had done something, but the aisles weren't empty anymore. The dolls had left their shelves, forming a loose circle on the floor. Their tiny hands were clasped together, their heads bowed slightly as if in prayer. I blinked, unsure if what I was seeing was real. Then, one of them turned its head to look at me. I recoiled, my back hitting the shelves behind me. The circle of dolls remained still, except for the one that was watching me now. "Nope," I whispered. I shut my eyes tightly, fighting the rising panic. The rules. I had to focus on the rules. Don't make eye contact after midnight. That was one of them. But I'd already broken that rule once. Hadn't I? With the doll on the shelf? Was that why this was happening? My thoughts were interrupted by a soft, shuffling sound. When I opened my eyes, the circle of dolls was closer. They were standing now, or more accurately, balancing on their little legs. Some were still holding hands, while others had their arms stretched toward me like they were waiting for me to join them. The clock ticked loudly behind me, each second dragging out like an eternity. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I felt like I couldn't move. Then, one of the dolls giggled again, its voice overlapping with another, and another. They were laughing at me. I let out a shaky breath and did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the broom I'd left leaning against the counter. "Stay back," I shouted, brandishing it like a weapon. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "I mean it." The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving the store in total silence once more. The dolls didn't move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the broom and waiting for something to happen. My arms ached, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me. The clock chimed again. 2 a.m. I'd survived another hour, but I didn't feel safe. If anything, the air felt heavier now, charged with something I couldn't explain. The dolls remained still, their glassy eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. I whispered to myself, gripping the broom tighter, "Just one more hour. You can do this." But deep down, I knew the worst was yet to come. 2 a.m. felt like it lasted an eternity. The dolls were motionless now, as though they were simply waiting. The air around me was thick, electric with tension, and I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that something was coming. But what could I do? I could barely move without shaking. I kept my grip on the broom, a useless weapon against whatever this was, but it was the only thing I had. Every so often, my eyes flicked toward the dolls, still arranged in their eerie circle, just to make sure none of them were moving. None of them were, but the silence between us was suffocating. I glanced at the clock above the counter. 3 a.m. I barely remembered hearing it strike, but somehow I'd made it to the witching hour. The point where nothing seemed safe, nothing could be trusted. I could feel the sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. My palms slick around the broom handle. Time had become a warped, terrifying thing. Every second stretched into a minute, every minute into an hour. The store's lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Darkness. I swallowed hard, my breath catching. This is it. Stay calm. That's what I had to do, right? That's what I told myself. And then I remembered the rule. At 3:33 a.m., close your eyes and keep them shut for exactly 30 minutes. I glanced at the clock again. I had just a few seconds. My heart skipped a beat. 3:33. I had to follow the rule. But how could I? I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond my own rapid breathing. What if I kept my eyes closed and something changed? What if the dolls moved again? What if they came closer? I closed my eyes. But the second I did, I realized how dangerous this was. My pulse skyrocketed, and I could feel my legs tensing up, ready to bolt at any moment. I wanted to open my eyes so badly, but I forced myself to keep them shut. 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I could hear the scuttling again. Faint at first, but growing louder. The distinct sound of tiny feet brushing against the floor. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I clutched the broom tighter, squeezing my eyes shut even harder. I felt a rush of cold air against my face, like something was moving closer. Something that shouldn't be moving. Something that had no business being here. Then the giggle. Soft at first, barely a sound, just a breath of air. Then louder, echoing in my ears, coming from all sides. A high-pitched, childlike sound danced in the darkness, and I was terrified to open my eyes. Terrified that if I did, I'd see them all standing there, just inches away, their porcelain faces twisted in ways they shouldn't be. The giggling stopped, and an awful silence fell over the room. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then, a whisper. A voice so close to my ear that I felt the hairs stand on end. It was soft, almost loving.
I see you.
My eyes shot open. The dolls. They were standing in front of me, surrounding me in a tight circle, their glassy eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to scream. Their heads tilted in unison, as if they were studying me, waiting for something. I jumped back, my heart hammering in my chest, and I tried to push the broom toward them like it would stop them from getting any closer. But they didn't move. They didn't have to. One of the dolls, the porcelain one with the blue sailor suit, stepped forward. Its tiny feet didn't make a sound as it shuffled toward me.
I see you.
It whispered again. A cold hand closed around my wrist, pulling me forward. I yanked my arm back, gasping, my heart racing. The dolls were speaking in unison now, their voices coming together like a chorus of whispering children.
I see you.
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 The words were getting louder, closer, and I felt my knees weaken. I couldn't stay upright much longer. My mind raced, trying to remember the rules. What could I do? What could I do? My eyes darted to the clock. 3:33 a.m. 30 minutes. It wasn't over yet. I had to close my eyes again. I had no choice. Without thinking, I squeezed my eyes shut, squeezing the broom between my hands to anchor myself, to hold myself together. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was thick and oppressive, as though the dolls were waiting for me to break. But I didn't break. 30 minutes. The rule was clear. I would survive this. I had to. But there was no guarantee of what would happen next. The silence that fell over me when I closed my eyes was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. Every breath was a struggle. Every second, a mile. The cold, damp air pressed against my skin, and I could feel the weight of it, like it was suffocating me. My pulse thudded in my ears, and all I could hear was my ragged breathing, the faint sound of my own heartbeat, and the low hum of the store's ancient structure creaking under the pressure of the night. I didn't dare open my eyes. 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes. I repeated the mantra over and over in my head, focusing all my energy on that number. But it felt like the minutes stretched on forever, dragging me deeper into the dark. My hands were shaking so badly that I was sure I was going to drop the broom. The fear clawing at my chest felt primal, like an animal trapped in a cage. Suddenly, the pressure in the air shifted. The buzzing in my ears grew louder, like a swarm of bees closing in around me. I felt it, close, so close. Something moving, brushing against my skin, a whispering presence right next to me. The giggling started again, faint at first, then louder, more insistent.
I see you.
The words echoed in my head, louder than the giggling, louder than the thudding of my heart. It's not real. It's not real. I squeezed my eyes shut harder. But I knew it was real. The giggling turned into a chorus, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on my chest, my throat, my stomach. I couldn't breathe. The rules, I had to follow them. They were the only thing keeping me from breaking completely. Then I heard it. The click of something shifting, followed by the sound of small, quick footsteps. They were all around me now. I could feel them, feel their eyes on me, feel them moving in sync, just inches away. My skin prickled, as if their cold, porcelain hands were brushing against my arms, my legs, my face. But I couldn't open my eyes. 30 minutes, 30 minutes. I counted in my head, ignoring the fear that threatened to swallow me whole. 1, 2, 3. The footsteps grew louder, more frantic. The giggling escalated into something more, louder, higher-pitched, frantic, as if the dolls were growing agitated. 4, 5, 6. My legs felt weak. The pressure of their presence was unbearable. I could feel their tiny porcelain fingers just at the edge of my consciousness, like 1,000 pricking needles. 7, 8, 9. I wanted to scream, to run, to break the rules, to open my eyes, but I didn't. I couldn't. I thought about what Mrs. Havisham had said. The final rule. The rule that was the hardest to follow. When the clock strikes 4 a.m., you will feel like you can't go on. That's when you must follow the last rule. You must leave the store. Leave the store. The clock. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd closed my eyes, but I had to open them. I had to check. But as I began to lift my eyelids, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, cold, smooth, and unyielding. No, my heart slammed into my chest as I fought the urge to scream. I clutched the broom tighter, my knuckles white from the pressure, and opened my eyes. The dolls were gone. The store was silent. I blinked, confused, scanning the aisles, but they were empty. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. It was just me and the quiet hum of the old building. The clock above the counter struck 4 a.m. with a final, resounding chime, and I didn't wait for another second. I dropped the broom, bolted from the counter, and ran toward the front door. My legs felt like lead, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear, but I didn't stop. I reached the door and pulled the handle with all my strength, not daring to look behind me. The door wouldn't open. I yanked harder, panic crawling up my spine as I realized what had happened. It's locked. Of course, it was. I turned to face the store once more. My breath ragged, my throat tight. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the doll in the pink dress. She was smiling again. Her eyes met mine.
I see you.
She whispered. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. And for the first time I understood what Mrs. Havisham meant. I had broken the final rule. You must leave the store. And now I was trapped. The dolls, the rules, the darkness, it was all real. And I would never leave.